Richard Okonkwo sat in his study on a Wednesday night in March 2023, staring at a letter he had just found in his desk drawer. The letter was addressed to him, but it had never been delivered. His late wife, Hamarar, had written it 3 weeks before she died of ovarian cancer in 2019. The letter had somehow slipped behind the drawer during the chaos of her final days, and Richard had only discovered it today while searching for an old contract. Hamarar's handwriting was shaky from the pain medication, but her words were clear. "Richard, I need to tell you something I should have said years ago. Our children don't love us. They love what we can give them. I've seen it. I've heard it. And I've been too afraid to tell you, because you work so hard to make them happy. But they're not good people, my love. They're waiting for us to die. Please, before I go, open your eyes and see what I see." Richard read the letter 5 times that night. His hands shook each time he finished it. Hamarar had been the kindest, most perceptive person he had ever known. She didn't make accusations lightly. If she had written this, she had seen something real. Something terrible. Richard was 68 years old and worth $4.7 billion. He had built his pharmaceutical empire from nothing, starting as a bus conductor in Ornichar, 1982, saving every kobo he earned, sleeping on factory floors during his first manufacturing job, teaching himself chemistry from library books because he couldn't afford university. By the time he was 45, he owned the largest generic drug manufacturer in West Africa. By 55, he had expanded into real estate, telecommunications, and oil exploration. By 60, Forbes had listed him as the 18th richest man in Africa. He had given his 4 children everything. Michael, 42 years old, was his firstborn son. Grace, 38, was his only daughter. Daniel, 35, was his quiet, intellectual third child. Zainab, 29, was his youngest, born from his second marriage to Hamarar after his first wife had died in a car accident in 1994. Richard had sent all 4 children to the best schools in the world. Michael had attended Harvard Business School. Grace had studied medicine at Johns Hopkins and become a pediatric surgeon. Daniel had gone to Oxford to study philosophy and literature. Zainab had been accepted to Stanford, but had dropped out after 1 semester and had never returned to formal education. Richard had bought each child a house when they turned 25. He paid each of them a monthly allowance of $50,000, regardless of whether they worked or not. He had given them board positions in his companies, luxury cars, access to his private jet, and credit cards with no spending limits. And now, sitting in his study with his dead wife's letter in his hands, Richard began to remember things he had ignored for years. The first incident, Michael's phone call. In July 2021, Richard had suffered a minor heart attack during a board meeting. It wasn't serious. The doctors said it was stress-related and that he would be fine with medication and rest. But for 3 hours, before the test results came back, Richard had been in the hospital wondering if he was about to die. Michael had been in London on vacation when it happened. Richard's assistant, a woman named Ngozi who had worked for him for 15 years, had called Michael to tell him about the heart attack. Michael had said he would fly back immediately, but he hadn't. Ngozi had been standing near Richard's hospital bed when Michael called back 2 hours later. Richard had been groggy for medication, so Ngozi had answered the phone for him. She had put it on speaker so Richard could hear. "How is he?" Michael had asked. "The doctors say he'll be fine," Ngozi had replied. "It was a minor episode. They're keeping him overnight for observation." There had been a long pause on the phone. Then Michael had said something that Ngozi would later tell Richard, she wished she hadn't heard. So, he's definitely going to be okay? They're sure. Yes, sir. The tests came back clear. His heart is strong. Another pause. Then Michael's voice had changed, becoming more formal and distant. Good. That's good. Tell him I'll visit when I get back next month. I've already paid for this vacation package, and the refund policy is terrible. Ngozi had looked at Richard with shock in her eyes. Richard had pretended to be too drugged to understand what he'd just heard. But he had understood perfectly. His firstborn son had just been told his father might die, and his first concern was about a vacation refund. When Richard had brought this up to Michael 3 weeks later during a family dinner, Michael had laughed it off. Dad, you're reading too much into it. I knew you were fine. Ngozi said so. If it had been serious, obviously I would have come back immediately. But it wasn't serious, so why waste money on a flight when I could see you the following month anyway? Richard had wanted to believe that explanation. He had forced himself to believe it. But Hamarar, who had been sitting beside him at that dinner, had squeezed his hand under the table and given him a look that said, "You heard what I heard. You know what it means." The second incident. Grace's birthday speech. In November 2021, Richard had thrown a massive birthday party for Grace's 37th birthday. He had rented out the Heko Hotel ballroom in Lagos, invited 300 guests, and hired a live band. The party had cost over 200 million naira, but Richard didn't care. Grace was his only daughter, and he wanted her to feel celebrated. During the party, Grace had been asked to give a speech. She had stood up on the stage, microphone in hand, wearing a designer dress that Richard had bought her from Paris. The crowd had applauded as she smiled and waved. "Thank you all for coming," Grace had said. "This has been an incredible night, and I'm so grateful to my father for organizing it." The crowd had applauded again. "My father is an amazing man," Grace had continued. "He built an empire from nothing. He's brilliant, hardworking, and generous." More applause. "But what I'm most grateful for," Grace had said, her smile widening, "is that he's taught me the most important lesson in life. Wealth is freedom. With money, you can do anything, be anything, control anything. And I plan to use everything he's given me to build my own empire that will outlast his." The crowd had thought it was an inspiring statement about ambition and independence. They had cheered. But Richard had heard something else in those words. Something cold. Hamarar had heard it too. She had leaned over to Richard during the applause and whispered, "Did she just say she wants to outlast you? Not honor you. Not continue your legacy. Outlast you." Richard had felt a chill run down his spine, but he had pushed it away. He had told himself that Hamarar was reading too much into it, that Grace was just expressing confidence and ambition. But 3 weeks later, Richard had been in his office when he overheard Grace on the phone with someone. His office door had been slightly open, and Grace had been in the hallway just outside, speaking in a low voice. Richard hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but Grace's tone had been sharp and angry, which was unusual enough to make him pause and listen. "I don't care what the board thinks," Grace had been saying. "When I take over the hospital chain, I'm liquidating the charity wings. They're bleeding money. Poor people can go to government hospitals. Our facilities should be for people who can actually pay." Richard had frozen. He had built those charity wings specifically to provide free health care to underprivileged children. It was the part of his legacy he was most proud of. And his daughter wanted to destroy it the moment she had control. Grace had continued. "My father is sentimental about this poverty nonsense because he came from nothing. But I didn't. And I'm not going to let his guilt-driven charity work tank my profit margins. Richard had closed his office door quietly and sat down at his desk, his heart pounding. He had never told Grace what he had heard, but he had never forgotten it either. The third incident. Daniel's dinner request. Daniel had always been the kindest of Richard's children. He was quiet, thoughtful, and uninterested in the family business. He taught literature at the University of Lagos and spent his weekends volunteering at orphanages and homeless shelters. He lived in a modest apartment in Yaba, drove a 10-year-old Toyota, and rarely asked his father for anything beyond his monthly allowance. So when Daniel had called Richard in February 2022 and asked if they could have dinner together, just the two of them, Richard had been happy. It was rare for any of his children to request one-on-one time with him. They had met at a quiet restaurant in Hechoyi on a Thursday evening. Daniel had been nervous, fidgeting with his water glass and avoiding eye contact. Richard had asked him what was wrong. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something important," Daniel had said. "Of course. What is it?" Daniel had taken a deep breath. "I need money." Richard had been surprised. Daniel never asked for extra money. "How much do you need?" 20 million naira. Richard had almost choked on his drink. 20 million? Daniel, what on earth do you need 20 million naira for? Daniel had looked down at his plate. "I'm starting a foundation for underprivileged children. I want to build schools in rural areas where kids don't have access to education. I've been planning this for 2 years, and I'm finally ready to launch it. But I need capital." Richard had felt pride swell in his chest. This was exactly the kind of thing he had hoped his children would do with their resources. "That's wonderful, Daniel. Of course, I'll give you the money. You don't even have to pay me back. Consider it a gift." Daniel had looked up, relief flooding his face. "Really? Just like that? Just like that? I'm proud of you, son." They had finished dinner, and Richard had transferred the money the next day. For 3 months, Richard had felt good about that conversation. He had told Hamara about it, and she had smiled sadly and said, "I hope you're right about him." Then in May 2022, Richard had been having lunch with an old friend named Chief Hardy Worley, a retired education minister who now worked as a consultant for various NGOs. Chief Hardy Worley had mentioned something in passing. "By the way, Richard, I heard your son Daniel is starting an education foundation. That's wonderful. Has he reached out to you for advice? These things can be tricky to set up properly." "He hasn't asked for advice," Richard had said. "But he's a smart boy. I'm sure he'll figure it out." Chief Hardy Worley had frowned. "Well, I hope he's working with reputable people. I've seen too many young idealists get taken advantage of by consultants who inflate their fees and deliver nothing." That comment had planted a seed of worry in Richard's mind. Over the next 2 weeks, he had casually asked Daniel how the foundation was progressing. Daniel had been vague each time, saying things like, "It's coming along and these things take time." So Richard had asked Ngozi to make some discreet inquiries. She had called around to education NGOs, government offices, and legal firms that specialized in foundation registration. No one had heard of Daniel's foundation. No paperwork had been filed. No land had been purchased for schools. Nothing. Richard had then asked his accountant to look into Daniel's bank records, something he had legal access to because he was the source of Daniel's allowance and had co-signed some of Daniel's accounts years ago. The accountant had discovered that the 20 million naira had been transferred to an account belonging to a woman named Chidinma Orkrafor. Richard had never heard that name before, so he had hired a private investigator to find out who she was. The investigator had come back with a report 2 weeks later. Chidinma Orkrafor was a 32-year-old woman who ran an online investment scheme. She had been arrested twice for fraud, but had never been convicted due to lack of evidence. She lived in a luxury apartment in Banana Island and drove a Range Rover. And she was Daniel's girlfriend. Daniel, the son Richard had thought was different, had lied to him. There was no foundation. There were no schools. Daniel had taken 20 million naira from his father and given it to a woman who ran investment scams. When Richard had confronted Daniel about it, Daniel had broken down crying. He had admitted that Chidinma had convinced him the investment scheme was legitimate and would triple his money in 6 months. He had planned to use the returns to actually start the foundation. He had been embarrassed to tell Richard the truth because he felt stupid for falling for it. Richard had wanted to believe that Daniel was just naive, not malicious. But the lie had been deliberate. The story about the foundation had been calculated and detailed. Daniel had looked his father in the eye and lied to him for money. Richard had given Daniel another 20 million naira to cover the loss, and he had never spoken about it again. But the trust had been broken. The fourth incident. Zainab's hospital visit. Zainab had always been the most troubled of Richard's children. She had dropped out of Stanford after 1 semester because, as she had told Richard at the time, university is boring and pointless. She had then spent 2 years traveling around Europe and Asia on Richard's money, posting photos on Instagram, and dating different men every few months. In 2020, when Zainab was 27, she had been arrested in Dubai for cocaine possession. Richard had spent $3 million in legal fees and bribes to get her out of jail and back to Nigeria. Zainab had promised him she would get clean and turn her life around. She hadn't. In August 2022, Hamarar had been in her final weeks of life, bedridden in their home with round-the-clock hospice care. The cancer had spread to her bones and lungs, and the doctors had said she had maybe 2 weeks left. Richard had been sitting beside Hamarar's bed one afternoon when Zainab had called him. She had been crying hysterically. "Daddy, I need you," she had sobbed. "Please come get me. I'm at a hotel in Victoria Island. I'm scared." Richard had asked what was wrong. "I took something," Zainab had said. "I don't know what it was. Someone gave me pills at a party, and now I can't stop shaking. I think I need to go to the hospital." Richard had felt his heart sink. Hamarar had been dying in the next room, and now Zainab was having a drug-related emergency. "I'll send a driver to get you," Richard had said. "Where exactly are you?" Zainab had given him the address of a hotel called the Renaissance. Richard had hung up and immediately called his driver, instructing him to pick up Zainab and take her to the nearest private hospital. But something about the call had felt wrong. Richard had noticed that Zainab's crying had sounded performative, rehearsed, and she had mentioned a party, but it was 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday. Richard had called the hotel and asked to be connected to Zainab's room. The receptionist had checked the guest list and said there was no one by that name registered. Richard had insisted, giving Zainab's full name and even her phone number. The receptionist had checked again and confirmed. No guest by that name. Richard had called Zainab back. "Are you sure you're at the Renaissance?" "Yes, Daddy. Room 402. They're saying you're not registered there." There had been a pause. Then Zainab had said quickly, "Oh, sorry. I'm registered under my friend's name. Just send the driver. Please." Richard had sent the driver, but he had also called the driver back 10 minutes later and told him to wait outside the hotel but not to go up to the room. Instead, Richard had instructed the driver to observe and report back. The driver had called Richard 30 minutes later with a strange report. "Sir, Your daughter just came out of the hotel. She looks fine. She's not shaking or crying. She got into a taxi with a man. They looked like they were laughing. Richard had felt something inside him crack. He had called Zainab immediately. Where are you? I'm waiting for your driver, Daddy. Is he coming? My driver is at the hotel. He says you just left with a man. Silence. Zainab, what is going on? Finally, Zainab had sighed. Okay, fine. I'm sorry. I didn't take anything. I just needed money. My credit card got declined at a store, and I was embarrassed. I thought if I said it was an emergency, you'd send cash with the driver. Richard had been too shocked to respond. I'm sorry, Daddy, Zainab had continued, her voice small now. I know it was wrong. But you always lecture me when I ask for money normally. This was easier. Richard had hung up without another word. He had gone back to Hamarar's bedside and sat down heavily. Hamarar had been barely conscious, but she had reached for his hand and squeezed it weakly. I told you, she had whispered. Those had been among the last words Hamarar had spoken to him before slipping into a coma 3 days later. She had died the following week, and Richard had been too consumed with grief to process what Zainab had done. But now, sitting in his study with Hamarar's letter in his hands, he remembered, and he felt the full weight of it. The final incident, the conference call. The incident that finally broke Richard's denial happened in January 2023, just 2 months before he found Hamarar's letter. Richard had been scheduled to speak at a pharmaceutical conference in Geneva, but he had come down with severe flu the day before his flight. His doctor had advised him not to travel, so Richard had canceled his trip and stayed home to recover. That same evening, Richard had been lying in bed when he decided to dial into a board meeting that was happening at his pharmaceutical headquarters in Lagos. The meeting was routine, quarterly earnings review, and Richard hadn't originally planned to attend because he had expected to be in Geneva. But since he was home anyway, he figured he might as well listen in. Richard had dialed the conference line and muted his microphone so he could listen without interrupting. The meeting had already started. His CFO was presenting the financial results. Then Michael's voice had come through the line. Before we continue, I want to address something. My father was supposed to be traveling today, which means he won't be on this call. Richard had been about to unmute himself and announce his presence, but something in Michael's tone had made him pause. I need everyone in this room to understand something, Michael had continued, his voice taking on an authority that Richard rarely heard from him. My father is 68 years old. He's had a heart attack. He's been sick repeatedly over the past year. We all know what this means. The line had gone silent. Within the next 5 years, maybe less, I will be running this company, Michael had said. And when that transition happens, things are going to change. The board composition will change. The management structure will change. The company priorities will change. So, I need to know right now, who in this room is going to be on my side when that happens? Richard had felt his blood run cold. One of the board members, a man named Mr. Ogunsanya, who had worked with Richard for 20 years, had spoken up. Michael, with all due respect, your father is still very much alive and in charge. This conversation feels premature and inappropriate. Inappropriate? Michael had laughed. What's inappropriate is pretending we're not all thinking about succession planning. My father built an incredible company, but he's from a different generation. His strategies are outdated. His sentimentality about charity work and social responsibility is costing us millions in profit every quarter. When I take over, we're going to run this company like a real business, not a philanthropic vanity project. Another board member, a woman named Dr. Hardy, had said, "Your father's philanthropic work is what earned this company its reputation and government contracts. Removing that would be smart," Michael had interrupted. "We don't need reputation. We need profit. And anyone who doesn't understand that won't have a place on my board." The meeting had continued for another 30 minutes, with Michael essentially conducting a loyalty test, asking each board member whether they would support his new direction for the company. Some had agreed enthusiastically. Others had been non-committal. A few, like Mr. Ogunsanya, had pushed back. Richard had listened to the entire thing in silence, his flu symptoms forgotten, his body cold with a different kind of sickness. After the call had ended, Richard had sat in his bed for an hour, staring at the wall. His firstborn son, the child he had groomed since birth to take over the family empire, had just held a secret meeting to undermine him and plan his obsolescence. Michael hadn't been planning for a distant future. He had been actively preparing for Richard's death. Richard had said nothing to Michael about the call. He had said nothing to anyone. He had simply filed the information away in his mind alongside all the other incidents he had been trying to ignore. And now, 2 months later, with Hamarar's letter in his hands, Richard finally admitted to himself what he had known for years but had refused to accept. His children didn't love him. They were waiting for him to die. And they had been waiting for a long time. Richard spent the next 3 weeks planning. He didn't tell anyone what he was planning because he couldn't trust anyone. His children had clearly cultivated allies within his organization, and Richard had no way of knowing who was loyal to him versus who was loyal to Michael or the others. So Richard reached out to someone from his past. Someone from before the wealth. Someone who had known him when he was nobody. Emeka Nwosu had been Richard's friend since childhood in Onitsha. They had grown up in the same neighborhood, attended the same primary school, and sold harkara together on street corners to earn money for school fees. But while Richard had pursued business, Emeka had joined the military and eventually the State Security Service. He had worked in intelligence for 20 years before retiring in 2018. Richard called Emeka on a Tuesday evening and asked if they could meet in person. They met at a small bar in Oberland, far from the high society circles where Richard usually operated. "I need your help with something," Richard said after they had greeted each other and ordered drinks. "And I need you to promise me that you will tell no one. Not your wife. Not your children. No one." Emeka studied his old friend's face. "You look terrible, Richard. What's wrong?" Richard told him everything. The incidents with his children, Hamarar's letter, the conference call, all of it. When Richard finished, Emeka sat back in his chair and let out a long breath. "Your children are vultures." "I know. So, what do you want to do about it?" Richard leaned forward. "I want to fake my death." Emeka didn't laugh or look surprised. He simply nodded slowly, his intelligence training evident in how quickly he processed the idea. "You want to see what they'll do when they think you're gone?" "Yes." "And then what? You come back to life and confront them?" "I don't know yet," Richard admitted. "Maybe. Or maybe I just rewrite my will and disappear for real. I just need to know the truth. I need to see it with my own eyes." Emeka took a sip of his beer. "This will require significant resources and planning. We're talking about faking a death convincingly enough to fool your entire family, your business associates, the media, and potentially the government. That's not simple. I have money, whatever you need." "It's not about money, Richard. It's about trust. We'll need people, a body, a coroner, a mortician, legal documentation. Every person we involve is a potential leak. That's why I came to you. You know how to handle this kind of operation. Emeka thought for a long moment. If we do this, we do it my way. Total operational security. You follow my instructions exactly. You don't tell anyone. Not your lawyer, not your assistant, not your pastor. No one. Agreed. And you accept that once this starts, there's no going back until it's finished. You can't change your mind halfway through. I understand. Emeka nodded. All right. Give me 2 weeks to set up the framework. Then we'll meet again, and I'll brief you on the plan. They shook hands, and Richard left that bar feeling something he hadn't felt in years. The setup. Over the next 2 weeks, Emeka worked with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades in covert operations. He assembled a team of 5 people, each one carefully vetted and compensated well enough to ensure their silence. The first person Emeka brought in was Dr. Chukwudi Obi, a retired pathologist who had worked with the Lagos State Mortuary for 30 years before retiring. Dr. Obi had seen everything in his career and had performed autopsies on everyone from street hawkers to governors. He was cynical, discreet, and motivated by money. Emeka paid him 2 million naira upfront with a promise of another 3 million upon successful completion of the operation. The second person was Bjorn Harde Yemor, a mortician who ran a private funeral home in Ikeja. Bjorn had worked with Emeka on a previous case involving the fake death of a witness who needed to disappear from organized crime syndicates. Bjorn knew how to prepare bodies, how to work with grieving families, and most importantly, how to keep secrets. Emeka paid him 1.5 million naira. The third person was Chief Harde Barrier Williams, a recently retired judge who still had connections throughout the legal system. Chief Williams would be responsible for ensuring that all death certificates, autopsy reports, and legal documentation appeared authentic and were filed correctly in government databases. He was expensive, 5 million naira, but his work would be flawless. The fourth person was Yusuf Abdullahi, a former colleague of Emeka's from the SSS who now worked as a private security consultant. Yusuf specialized in surveillance, both installing it and detecting it. He would sweep Richard's homes and offices for any existing surveillance equipment and then install hidden cameras that would allow Richard to observe his children's reactions during and after the funeral. The fifth and final person was Pastor Emmanuel Harde Oyi, the head pastor of a small church in Surulere. Pastor Emmanuel had once been involved in a financial scandal that Emeka had helped him cover up years ago. He owed Emeka a favor, and that favor was being called in now. Pastor Emmanuel would conduct the funeral service, lend religious legitimacy to the proceedings, and ensure that the church community's presence would add authenticity to the event. With the team assembled, Emeka met with Richard again at the same bar in Horber Lane Day. The plan is simple in concept but complex in execution, Emeka explained, spreading out a handwritten timeline on the table between them. We stage a car accident on 3rd Mainland Bridge. You'll be driving your Mercedes G-Wagon, the one everyone recognizes, at night during heavy rain. The vehicle will crash through the barrier and go into the lagoon. Witnesses will see it happen. How do we get witnesses? Richard asked. We don't need to get them. 3rd Mainland Bridge always has witnesses. But we'll have Yusuf and 2 of his associates positioned nearby to call emergency services immediately and provide consistent testimony about what they saw. What about my body? We'll use a substitute. Dr. Obi has arranged for the body of a homeless man who died of natural causes 3 days ago. The man was approximately your age, height, and build. His family has been compensated generously, and has agreed to donate his body to medical science, which gives us legal cover. After we stage the accident, the body will be recovered from the lagoon within 6 hours, long enough for water damage to complicate identification, but not so long that decomposition becomes an issue. Won't my family want to see the body? They will. That's why Bjorn will prepare the body specifically to prevent that. He'll create convincing trauma injuries consistent with a car crash and drowning. The face will be damaged enough that viewing is not recommended. When your family insists, and they will, they'll be shown the body in a closed room for 30 seconds maximum, and the trauma will be obvious enough that they won't look too closely. Human psychology works in our favor here. People don't want to see their loved ones destroyed, so they'll accept the closed casket. What about DNA testing? Chief Williams has arranged for a corrupted chain of custody in the forensic samples. The samples that would normally go to the lab for DNA testing will be replaced with samples from you, which we'll collect tomorrow. The lab will confirm that the body is yours, and that report will be filed officially. If anyone questions it years later, the paperwork will all check out. Richard felt his stomach turn. This feels evil. Emeka supplied. Manipulative? Yes, it is. That's why you need to be absolutely certain you want to do this. Because once we start, Richard, we're committing fraud on a massive scale. Death certificates are legal documents. Insurance claims will be filed. Your estate will go through probate. This isn't a prank. This is serious. Richard thought about Hamarar's letter, about Michael's conference call, about all 4 of his children circling him like sharks waiting for blood. I'm certain, Richard said. The accident. On March 15, 2023, at 9:47 p.m., Richard Okonkwo's Mercedes G-Wagon crashed through the barrier of 3rd Mainland Bridge and plunged into the Lagos Lagoon. At least, that's what the witnesses reported. In reality, Richard had driven to a safe house in Victoria Island earlier that evening, where he had met with Emeka and Yusuf. Yusuf's team had taken Richard's G-Wagon, driven it to a predetermined section of 3rd Mainland Bridge during a rainstorm, and at the exact planned moment, had accelerated the vehicle toward the barrier while the driver, actually Yusuf himself, had jumped out seconds before impact. The vehicle had crashed through the barrier exactly as designed and had plunged into the dark water below. Meanwhile, the homeless man's body, dressed in Richard's clothes and wearing Richard's watch and ring, had been placed in the water nearby by Dr. Obi and 2 assistants an hour before the crash. The body had been weighted to sink initially, but had been rigged to surface approximately 4 hours later when the weights released on a timer. 3 witnesses, Yusuf's associates, had been positioned at strategic points on the bridge. They had immediately called emergency services, all reporting the same story. They had seen a Mercedes G-Wagon lose control in the rain and crash into the lagoon. One witness had even taken a video on his phone showing the vehicle's taillights disappearing into the water. The video would later circulate on Twitter and Instagram, providing visual proof of the accident. The Lagos State Emergency Management Agency had arrived within 20 minutes and had begun search and recovery operations. The vehicle had been located using sonar within 2 hours. The body had been found at 2:14 a.m., exactly on schedule. Dr. Obi, in his capacity as a consulting pathologist, had been called in to examine the body at the recovery site. He had officially identified visible trauma consistent with the accident and had authorized the body's transport to the morgue at Lagos University Teaching Hospital. By 6:00 a.m., the news was everywhere. Every television station in Nigeria was running the story. Billionaire pharmaceutical magnate Richard Okonkwo dead in tragic bridge accident. Radio stations interrupted regular programming to announce the news. Hashtag RIP Richard Okonkwo began trending on Twitter within an hour of the official announcement. Richard watched all of this from a secret apartment in Victoria Island that Emeka had secured for him. The apartment had 5 television screens, each tuned to a different news channel. It had a computer with internet access, so Richard could monitor social media. And it had a sophisticated security system that allowed Richard to view the hidden cameras that Yusuf had installed in Richard's primary residence, his children's homes, and his various offices. Richard had expected to feel something dramatic when he watched the news of his own death. Sadness. Fear. Something profound. Instead, he felt numb. He watched strangers cry on television about a man they'd never met. He watched politicians release statements about his contributions to Nigeria's economy. He watched business analysts discuss what his death would mean for pharmaceutical stocks. And then he switched the camera feed to Michael's house. Michael's response. Michael lived in a mansion in Banana Island with his wife, Amanda, and their 3 children. The house had cost 1.2 billion naira, and Richard had paid for it. When Yusuf had installed the cameras 2 weeks earlier, he had placed one in Michael's home office, one in the master bedroom, and one in the living room. Richard had felt guilty about this level of invasion, but Emeka had insisted. You need to see everything, not just what they do in public. What they do when they think no one is watching. At 7:30 a.m. on March 16th, Amanda received a phone call from Ngozi, Richard's assistant. The camera in the master bedroom captured Amanda's scream of shock. She had dropped her phone and had started crying immediately. Michael had been in the bathroom when this happened. He had come running out, his face full of concern. What happened? Amanda, what's wrong? Amanda had been sobbing too hard to speak. She had just pointed at her phone. Michael had picked it up and had seen the missed call from Ngozi. He had called her back, and Richard had watched Michael's face as Ngozi told him about the accident. Michael's expression had gone through several phases. First shock, his eyes widening, his mouth opening. Then confusion, his brow furrowing as he asked Ngozi to repeat what she'd said. Then something else. Something that made Richard's chest tighten. Michael's face had gone completely blank. Not sad. Not devastated. Just calculating. Are they sure it's him? Michael had asked Ngozi. His voice was steady. Too steady. Amanda had looked up at her husband, still crying. Michael, your father is dead. What do you mean, are they sure? Michael had held up a hand to silence Amanda, while he continued listening to Ngozi. What about the body? Have they recovered it? Has anyone identified it officially? The Lagos State Emergency Management Agency recovered a body early this morning, Ngozi had said, her voice breaking with grief. Dr. Obi from the state pathologist's office has confirmed it's your father. The injuries are, they said it's definitely him. Michael had been silent for a long moment. Then he had said, I need you to send me all the official documentation as soon as it's available. Death certificate, accident report, everything. Email it directly to me, not to the family lawyer. Michael, shouldn't we? Just do what I'm asking, Ngozi. I need to handle this properly. Michael had hung up and had immediately made another call. Richard watched as his son scrolled through his contacts and selected a name. Kenneth Hudor, lawyer. Kenneth Hudor was not the family lawyer. Kenneth Hudor was Michael's personal attorney, a man Richard had never heard of. The call connected, and Michael's voice became businesslike and cold. Kenneth, it's Michael. My father died last night in an accident. I need you to meet me at my office in 2 hours. Bring everything we discussed last year about succession planning and will contestation strategies. Amanda had stared at her husband with horror. Michael, your father just died and you're calling a lawyer? You should be calling your siblings. You should be. I'll call them later, Michael had said, not looking at his wife. Right now, I need to protect this family's interests. Your father's body is barely cold, and you're talking about being smart, Michael had interrupted sharply. Amanda, you don't understand how these things work. My father's will is going to be a battlefield. My siblings are going to fight for every naira they can get. Grace has always thought she deserved more because she's a doctor. Daniel will try to claim he needs money for his fake charity work. And Zainab will probably show up high, crying about how she's the baby and deserves special treatment. If I don't move first, they'll move and I'll lose. This isn't about winning and losing, Michael. Your father. My father is dead, Michael had said flatly. And the business of the living is to secure their future. I loved him, but love doesn't pay mortgages. Love doesn't maintain our lifestyle. Money does. And I'm going to make sure we get our fair share. Amanda had looked at her husband like she was seeing him for the first time. I don't know who you are right now. Michael had ignored her and had started getting dressed, pulling on an expensive suit with mechanical efficiency. He had left the house 20 minutes later without comforting his wife or his children, who were now awake and asking questions about why their mother was crying. Richard had watched this entire exchange and had felt something die inside him. Not hope, he'd lost that already, but the last small possibility that maybe, just maybe, he'd been wrong about Michael. He hadn't been wrong. Grace's response. Grace lived in a luxury apartment in Ikoyi with her husband, David, who was an investment banker. They had no children. Grace had always said her career was too demanding for motherhood. The camera in Grace's apartment was positioned in her home office, which was where she spent most of her time when she wasn't at the hospital. Grace received the news at 8:15 a.m. when David came into her office, his face pale. Grace, you need to sit down. Grace had looked up from her laptop, annoyed. I'm in the middle of reviewing surgical schedules, David. What is it? It's your father. There's been an accident. Grace, he's dead. Grace had frozen. Her hands had stopped moving on the keyboard. She had stared at her husband for a full 10 seconds without blinking. What do you mean, dead? His car went off 3rd Mainland Bridge last night. They recovered his body this morning. Grace, I'm so sorry. Grace had stood up slowly. She had walked to the window of her office and had looked out at the Lagos skyline. David had approached her, trying to put his hand on her shoulder, but Grace had stepped away from him. I need to make some calls, Grace had said. Grace, maybe you should just process this first. Call your siblings. Grieve. I said I need to make some calls. Grace had picked up her phone and had dialed a number. The camera's audio pickup was excellent. Yusuf had installed professional-grade equipment, so Richard could hear both sides of the conversation clearly. Dr. Adelik, it's Grace Williams, she had said when the call connected. I apologize for calling so early, but something's happened. My father passed away last night. Dr. Adelik had been the chairman of the hospital board where Grace worked. He had expressed his condolences and had told Grace to take whatever time she needed. Actually, that's not why I'm calling, Grace had said. I need to schedule an emergency board meeting for next week. I want to accelerate the transition timeline we discussed for my acquisition of the hospital chain. There had been a pause on the other end. Grace, your father just died. Are you sure this is the right time to? This is exactly the right time, Grace had interrupted. My father's estate is going to be complex and contested. If I wait, the hospital assets could be frozen in probate for years. I need to move now while I have liquidity and access to my inheritance timeline. Can you schedule the meeting or not? Dr. Adelik had reluctantly agreed to schedule a meeting for the following Wednesday. Grace had made 3 more calls after that. One to her accountant, asking for a complete assessment of her current financial position and projected inheritance. One to a real estate agent, asking about the current market value of Richard's property portfolio, specifically the parcels she had been promised. And one to a corporate lawyer, asking about the legal process for assuming board positions in her father's companies. Not once during any of these calls had Grace cried. Not once had her voice wavered. She had been completely composed, completely businesslike, completely focused on money and power. David had watched his wife with growing disbelief. Grace, what are you doing? I'm doing what needs to be done. Your father died less than 2 hours ago and you're calling lawyers and accountants? Grace had turned to face her husband, and her expression had been ice cold. David, my father built an empire worth almost $5 billion. That empire is now going to be divided among 4 children, which means if I don't act strategically, I'll lose significant value. Michael is already making moves. I guarantee you he's on the phone with lawyers right now. I'm not going to let my idiot brother outmaneuver me because I was too busy trying to think clearly. This is insane, Grace. You sound like a corporate raider, not a daughter. I'm both, Grace had said. And right now, the corporate raider side is going to keep us rich. She had gone back to her laptop and had started typing furiously, pulling up spreadsheets and financial documents. David had left the room, shaking his head. Richard had watched his daughter, his brilliant, accomplished daughter, reduce his death to a business opportunity within 2 hours of learning about it. He had watched her calculate his worth in naira and assets before she had even asked where his body was or how the accident had happened. Grace hadn't cried. She hadn't called her siblings. She hadn't asked to see his body. She had just started planning how to maximize her inheritance. Daniel's response. Daniel lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Yarba that Richard had bought for him years ago. He shared the apartment with Chidinma, the woman who had scammed him out of 20 million naira. Apparently, despite the fraud, Daniel had stayed with her. Richard hadn't known this. Daniel had hidden the relationship from his family. The camera in Daniel's apartment was in the living room, which was small and cluttered with books, papers, and cheap furniture that looked like it belonged to a graduate student rather than the son of a billionaire. Daniel received the news at 9 a.m. when his phone rang. He had been sitting on his couch, reading a book. Chidinma had been in the kitchen making breakfast. Daniel had answered the call. Hello. It had been Grace. Daniel, where are you? I'm at home.
Why?
What's wrong? Dad is dead. Car accident last night on 3rd Mainland Bridge. Richard had watched his son's face collapse. The book had fallen from Daniel's hands. His mouth had opened, but no sound had come out. He had started shaking. Daniel? Are you there? What? What do you mean, dead? Grace had given him the basic details, the accident, the recovery, the body at the morgue. Michael and I are going to LUTH to identify the body officially. Can you meet us there in an hour? Yes. Yes, I'll be there. Daniel had hung up and had sat frozen on his couch. Chidinma had come into the living room, asking what was wrong. Daniel hadn't answered. He had just started crying, deep, wrenching sobs that shook his entire body. Chidinma had sat beside him and had held him, asking repeatedly what happened. Finally, Daniel had managed to say, "My father died." Chidinma had made appropriate sympathetic sounds, rubbing Daniel's back and letting him cry. They had sat like that for several minutes. Then Chidinma's phone had rung. She had pulled it out, checked the caller ID, and had stood up. I need to take this. She had walked into the bedroom, but the apartment was small enough that the camera's audio had picked up her conversation anyway. Hey, it's not a good time, Chidinma had said to whoever was on the phone. Then, after listening for a moment, she had lowered her voice. No, I can't talk about that right now. Daniel's father just died. A pause. Yes, the rich one. The billionaire. Another pause, longer this time. I know what it means, Chidinma had hissed. It means Daniel is about to inherit a lot of money, which means the investment opportunity we discussed just became much more viable. But I need to wait until the timing is right. He's devastated right now. Give me a few days. Richard had felt sick. Daniel's girlfriend, the woman he was crying in front of in the next room, was already planning how to exploit his inheritance. Chidinma had ended the call and had come back to the living room, her face sympathetic again. Baby, I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do? Daniel had looked up at her with red, swollen eyes. I need to go identify the body. I need to see him. Of course. I'll drive you. No, Daniel had said, standing up shakily. I need to do this alone. With my family. Are you sure? I want to support you. I'm sure. I'll call you later. After Daniel had left, Chidinma had immediately made another phone call. Okay, he's gone. Here's the situation. Daniel's father was worth about $5 billion. Daniel will probably get at least $1 billion, maybe more. We need to position the new investment scheme as a memorial project, something honoring his father. Daniel's emotional right now, which makes him vulnerable. If we move carefully, we can get at least $200 million out of him within the next month. Richard had listened to this conversation and had felt his opinion of Daniel shift. His son wasn't malicious. He was just weak, easily manipulated, surrounded by a predator who saw him as nothing more than a source of money. Daniel loved him. Richard believed that. The tears had been real. The grief had been genuine. But Daniel was also the kind of man who would be robbed blind by everyone around him because he trusted too easily and saw the best in people who didn't deserve it. Zainab's response. Zainab didn't have her own apartment. She had been living in a hotel suite at the Heko Hotel for the past 8 months, with Richard paying the monthly bill of 3 million naira. The hotel suite had become her semi-permanent residence because, as she had told Richard, I like the room service and I don't have to worry about maintenance. Yusuf hadn't been able to install cameras in the hotel room. The security was too tight and the risk was too high. So Richard had no way of watching Zainab's immediate reaction to his death. But Emeka had arranged for an associate to be positioned in the hotel lobby, observing. The associate was a woman named Funmi who worked as a private investigator. She had checked into the hotel the day before Richard's death and had been instructed to monitor Zainab's movements. According to Funmi's report, which she called into Emeka at 10:30 a.m., Zainab had received the news via phone call at approximately 9:45 a.m. Funmi had been sitting in the lobby cafe when Zainab had come down from her room, already crying and screaming hysterically. Zainab had been shouting at the hotel staff, demanding that they call her a car immediately. She had been sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. Several guests had stared at her. 2 staff members had tried to calm her down, but she had pushed them away. My father is dead, Zainab had screamed. My father is dead, and I need to go to the hospital right now. A hotel security officer had called a taxi for her, and Zainab had left the hotel still sobbing, her makeup running down her face, her clothes disheveled. Funmi had followed Zainab in a separate car. Zainab had gone directly to Lagos University Teaching Hospital, where the morgue was located. She had run into the building and had found her siblings, Michael, Grace, and Daniel, standing in a waiting area outside the morgue. Funmi hadn't been able to get close enough to hear the conversation, but she had taken photos from a distance showing Zainab collapsing into Daniel's arms, both of them crying while Michael stood apart on his phone, and Grace stood with her arms crossed, looking impatient. Based on the visual evidence, Zainab's grief appeared genuine. But Richard knew he needed more than appearances. He needed to see what Zainab would do in the days and weeks following his death, when the immediate shock wore off and decisions needed to be made. At 11 a.m. on March 16th, Dr. Obi escorted Richard's 4 children into a private viewing room at the Lagos University Teaching Hospital morgue. Emeka had managed to get a camera into this room through a contact who worked in hospital security. The camera was hidden in what appeared to be a smoke detector mounted on the ceiling. Richard watched the feed from his apartment in Victoria Island as his 4 children entered the cold, sterile room where a body lay on a metal table, covered with a white sheet. Dr. Obi spoke in a professional, sympathetic tone. "I need to prepare you for what you're about to see. Your father's injuries from the accident and subsequent time in the water have caused significant trauma to his face and upper body. I strongly recommend that you not look for too long. Many families find it traumatic." Michael stepped forward. "We need to see him. For closure." Dr. Obi nodded and pulled back the sheet to reveal the body's face. Bjorn, the mortician, had done exceptional work. The body did look like Richard, same age, same build, same skin tone. The face had been carefully damaged using techniques that Bjorn had learned during his 30 years in the profession. There was swelling, discoloration, and strategic trauma that made detailed identification difficult while still maintaining general recognizability. Grace looked at the body for approximately 5 seconds, then turned away, her hand over her mouth. "That's him." Michael stared longer, his face expressionless. "Are you sure? The face is pretty damaged." "We performed dental record matching," Dr. Obi said smoothly, "and we have DNA samples being processed. But based on the dental records, this is definitely your father." This was a lie. The dental records had been falsified by Chief Williams, the corrupt judge. But it sounded official and convincing. Daniel couldn't even look. He had turned away immediately, sobbing. Zainab had pushed forward, trying to get closer to the body. "Let me see him. I need to see him properly." Dr. Obi had gently but firmly guided her back. "Miss Williams, I really don't recommend." "I don't care what you recommend," Zainab had shouted. "That's my father." She had broken free and had reached the table, staring down at the body. Her face had gone through several expressions: horror, grief, confusion. "His hands," Zainab had said suddenly. "Show me his hands." Dr. Obi had hesitated. "Show me his hands," Zainab had screamed. Dr. Obi had pulled back more of the sheet, revealing the body's hands. The hands had been carefully prepared. They had Richard's ring, his watch, and similar age spots and scars. Bjorn had studied photographs of Richard's hands for hours to get the details right. Zainab had grabbed one of the hands and had held it, crying. "Daddy," she had whispered. "Daddy, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Grace had pulled Zainab away. "That's enough. Let's go." Michael had signed the official identification paperwork without hesitation. The body was confirmed as Richard Okonkwo. The death certificate would be filed within 24 hours. As the four siblings left the morgue, Richard watched them through the camera. Michael was already on his phone again. Grace was walking quickly, her face set in determination. Daniel was being supported by Zainab, both of them crying. Richard switched off the monitor and sat in silence in his secret apartment. The first phase was complete. They all believed he was dead. Now came the hard part, watching what they would do with that belief. The funeral. The funeral took place on March 30th, 2023, exactly 2 weeks after Richard's death. It was, as Michael had planned, a massive affair. Over 1,800 people attended. The president of Nigeria sent a representative. 3 state governors came personally. Business leaders from across Africa flew in. The Redeemed Christian Church of God Cathedral was filled to capacity, with overflow crowds watching on screens set up outside. Richard watched the funeral through multiple camera feeds that Yusuf had set up at the church. There were cameras in the main hall, in the private family room, and even one on the pulpit, disguised as part of the sound equipment. The casket was closed as planned. It was made of solid mahogany with gold handles and had cost 8 million naira. It sat at the front of the church, covered in white roses. Richard stared at his own casket on the monitor screen and felt profoundly disconnected from reality. Pastor Emmanuel conducted the service with appropriate gravitas. He spoke about Richard's life, his accomplishments, his generosity. He talked about Richard's journey from poverty to wealth, his commitment to family, his contributions to Nigerian society. It was all true, and it all felt like lies. The eulogies began. Michael spoke first. Michael stood at the podium in an expensive black suit, his face the picture of grief. He had practiced this speech. Richard knew because Yusuf had captured footage of Michael rehearsing in his home office the night before. "My father was an extraordinary man," Michael began, his voice catching in exactly the right places. "He taught me everything I know about business, about leadership, about integrity." Richard almost laughed at the word integrity. He built an empire from nothing. He created thousands of jobs. He changed lives. And he did it all while being a devoted father who always put his family first. This was such a profound lie that Richard wondered if Michael even believed it himself. Richard had rarely been home. He had missed birthday parties, school plays, graduations. He had been so focused on building wealth that he had forgotten to build relationships. But the crowd didn't know that. They applauded Michael's beautiful words about a father-son relationship that had barely existed. Michael continued, "My greatest hope is that I can continue his legacy with the same wisdom and vision he showed throughout his life. I promise you, Dad." Michael's voice broke convincingly here. "I will honor everything you built. I will protect it. I will grow it. And I will make you proud." The crowd erupted in applause. Michael returned to his seat, and several people reached out to pat his shoulder sympathetically. Richard watched his son's performance and felt nothing but cold disgust. Grace spoke next. Her eulogy was shorter, but equally manipulative. "My father taught me that success requires sacrifice," Grace said. "He showed me that brilliance and hard work can overcome any obstacle. He believed in me when I wanted to become a doctor, and he supported every step of my journey." This was technically true, but Grace left out the part where she planned to destroy Richard's charitable hospitals the moment she had control of them. "Dad, you gave me so much," Grace said, tears streaming down her face. Real tears, but Richard suspected they were tears of stress and exhaustion, not grief. "And I will honor your memory by continuing to heal people, by saving lives, by making a difference in this world the way you did." More applause. Grace returned to her seat. Daniel's eulogy was different. When Daniel stood at the podium, his hands were shaking. His eyes were red and swollen. Unlike his siblings, Daniel hadn't practiced. He had notes, but he barely looked at them. "I don't know how to do this," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to summarize my father's life in a few minutes. I don't know how to explain what he meant to me." Daniel paused, crying. "My dad and I didn't always understand each other. He wanted me to be a businessman. I wanted to be a teacher. He valued profit. I valued purpose. We argued. We disagreed. We spent years barely talking." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the polished, sanitized eulogy they expected. "But he was still my dad," Daniel continued. "And even when we fought, even when we couldn't see eye to eye, I knew he loved me. Maybe he didn't know how to show it. Maybe I didn't know how to receive it. But it was there." Daniel looked down at the casket. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry we wasted so much time being strangers. I'm sorry I never told you enough that I was proud to be your son. I'm sorry for all the things left unsaid." Daniel broke down completely and couldn't finish. He stumbled back to his seat, still crying. Richard watched this and felt his chest tighten. Daniel's grief was real. The regret was real. But Daniel was also weak. And weakness, Richard had learned, was just another form of betrayal. Finally, Zainab stood to speak. She looked terrible. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow. She had clearly not been sleeping or eating properly. Zainab walked to the podium and stood there silently for almost 30 seconds, staring at the casket. "My dad deserved a better daughter than me," she finally said. The crowd went silent. "I was a disappointment. I dropped out of school. I got arrested. I did drugs. I stole from him. I lied to him. I made his life harder when he was already sick and tired." Grace stood up from her seat, trying to signal Zainab to stop, but Zainab ignored her. "And you know what he did?" Zainab's voice was getting louder. "He loved me anyway. He never gave up on me, even when I gave up on myself. Even when I was at my worst. He still believed I could be better." Zainab was crying now, her whole body shaking. "I don't deserve to inherit anything from him. I don't deserve his money or his name. I wish I had more time. I wish I could show him that he was right to believe in me. I wish I could make him proud before." She couldn't finish. She collapsed at the podium, sobbing. Daniel and 2 ushers helped her back to her seat. The crowd sat in shocked silence. Pastor Emmanuel quickly moved to conclude the service before the emotional atmosphere became completely unmanageable. As the service ended and the casket was carried out to the hearse, Richard watched his children follow behind it. Michael and Grace walked with composed dignity. Daniel and Zainab walked together, both crying. The burial took place at a private cemetery in Ikoyi, attended only by family and close friends. The grave had been prepared in advance, a plot Richard had purchased years ago, never imagining it would be used this way. As the casket was lowered into the ground, Richard watched his children stand at the graveside. Michael checked his phone twice during the burial. Grace stood with her arms crossed, her face expressionless. Daniel wept openly. Zainab knelt at the edge of the grave, her fingers touching the casket one last time before it disappeared. "Goodbye, Daddy," Zainab whispered. Richard turned off the monitor. He couldn't watch anymore. The will reading. 1 week after the funeral, on April 6, 2023, the 4 siblings gathered at Barrister Hardiaimi's law office for the reading of Richard's will. Yusuf had installed a camera in Barrister Hardiaimi's conference room weeks earlier, hidden inside a wall clock. The camera provided a perfect view of the long table where the siblings would sit. All 4 arrived within minutes of each other. Michael came with his personal lawyer, Kenneth Hudor. Grace came alone but had her phone recording the session. Richard could see the phone positioned on the table. Daniel came with Chidinma, which surprised Richard. Zainab came alone, looking exhausted and fragile. Barrister Hardiimi entered the room carrying a thick folder. He was a 72-year-old man with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, dressed in traditional legal robes. He had been Richard's lawyer for 25 years and was one of the few people Richard had trusted completely. "Good afternoon," Barrister Hardiimi said formally. "Thank you all for coming. I know this has been a difficult time for your family. Let's proceed with the reading of your father's last will and testament." He opened the folder and pulled out a document. This will was last updated on February 14th, 2023, approximately 1 month before your father's death. It was witnessed by 2 independent parties and has been validated by this office as legally binding. Michael leaned forward. "Before you continue, I want to state for the record that my lawyer, Kenneth Hudor, is present to ensure that this process is conducted fairly." Barrister Hardiimi looked at Michael over his glasses. "Mr. Williams, this is not a courtroom. This is simply a reading of your father's wishes. Your lawyer is welcome to observe, but I will not be entertaining interruptions or challenges during the reading itself. If you wish to contest the will, you may do so through proper legal channels afterward." Michael sat back, his jaw clenched. Barrister Hardiimi began reading. "I, Richard Okonkwo, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament." The preliminary legal language took several minutes. Then Barrister Hardiimi reached the distribution of assets. "To my firstborn son, Michael Williams, I leave 40% of the shares in Okonkwo Pharmaceuticals, the property located at Plot 47, Banana Island, Lagos, and the sum of $50 million in cash." Michael nodded slowly. He had clearly expected something in this range. Kenneth Hudor was taking notes. "To my daughter, Grace Williams, I leave ownership of the Lekki Peninsula Hospital and Medical Center, 30% of my real estate portfolio as detailed in Appendix A, and the sum of $40 million in cash." Grace showed no reaction, but Richard could see her hands tighten on the armrests of her chair. "To my son, Daniel Williams, I leave the family home in Onitsha where I was born and raised, $20 million to establish an educational trust fund with specific conditions outlined in Appendix B, and complete ownership of my personal library, journals, and all documents related to my life history." Daniel looked confused. That's it. "Let me finish," Barrister Hardiimi said. "And to my youngest daughter, Zainab Williams, I leave the beach house in Calabar and $5 million to be distributed in monthly installments of $20,000 over the next 20 years. However, this inheritance is conditional." Zainab looked up, fear in her eyes. Zainab must complete a university degree program at an accredited institution and maintain documented sobriety for 5 consecutive years. Upon meeting these conditions, an additional $50 million will be released to her. If she fails to meet these conditions within 10 years of my death, the additional $50 million will be donated to the Lagos State Drug Rehabilitation Center. The room went silent. Michael was the first to speak. "This is absurd. You're giving Daniel the smallest monetary inheritance and Zainab's is completely conditional? This distribution is unbalanced and unfair." "I'm not finished," Barrister Hardiimi said firmly. "There is one more provision that applies to all beneficiaries." He pulled out another document. "This is an addendum to the will, signed by your father 3 days before his death. It states the following. If any of my children contest this will in court, or if any 2 or more of my children engage in litigation against each other regarding my estate within 5 years of my death, then all assets designated to those involved in the legal dispute will be immediately forfeited and donated to the Richard Okonkwo Foundation for Educational Development, a charitable organization established for this purpose." The only exception to this rule is if evidence of fraud or coercion in the creation of this will can be proven in court. Michael stood up, his face red. This is manipulation. He's controlling us from beyond the grave. Your father was very clear about his wishes, Barrister Hardy said calmly. He wanted to ensure that his estate would not tear this family apart. Grace spoke up, her voice tight. What about the remaining assets? The 40% of pharmaceutical shares that weren't given to Michael? The 70% of real estate not given to me? Where does all of that go? Barrister Hardy turned to another page. The remaining shares of Okonkwo Pharmaceuticals will be held in trust and managed by an independent board of directors until such time as your father's grandchildren reach the age of 25. The remaining real estate will also be placed in trust, with rental and development income being divided equally among all four of you during your lifetimes, after which ownership transfers to the grandchildren. And if we don't have grandchildren? Michael asked. Then upon the death of the last surviving child, all remaining assets transfer to the charitable foundation. Michael turned to Kenneth Hudor. This is contestable. This has to be contestable. Kenneth looked at the documents carefully. Sir, this will was properly witnessed and executed, and the penalty clause for contesting it is severe. If you challenge this and lose, you forfeit everything you were given. Grace leaned back in her chair, her face pale. He trapped us. He knew we would want more, so he trapped us with the threat of losing what we have. Daniel spoke quietly. Or maybe he just wanted us to accept what he gave us and move on with our lives. Easy for you to say, Michael snapped. You got the family home and some sentimental nonsense. Grace and I got the actual business assets, which means we have to manage them, grow them, deal with all the responsibility while you and Zainab get to coast. You got $50 million in cash, Michael, Daniel replied. How is that coasting? It's nothing compared to what the pharmaceutical company is worth. Then give it to me, Daniel said. If it's such a burden, I'll take it. Michael pointed at his brother. You see? This is exactly what he wanted. He wanted us to fight. He wanted to punish us. Zainab finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Or maybe he wanted to help me. Maybe he knew I needed structure and conditions because I'm not strong enough to handle money without destroying myself. Michael laughed bitterly. Wake up, Zainab. He didn't believe in you. If he believed in you, he would have given you the money unconditionally, like he gave the rest of us. This isn't love. This is doubt. You don't know what he believed, Zainab said, tears forming in her eyes. I know he's dead, and he's still trying to control our lives. Barrister Hardy cleared his throat. If you're all finished, there's one more thing. Your father left a video message. He requested that you watch it together. He set up a laptop on the conference table and pressed play. Richard's face appeared on the screen. He was sitting in his study, the same study where he had found Hamarar's letter. He looked tired but calm. The video had been recorded 2 weeks before his staged death, with Emika's help. If you're watching this, I'm gone, Richard said on the screen. And I need to tell you something I couldn't say while I was alive, because I was afraid. The 4 siblings leaned forward, watching intently. I failed you. All of you. I gave you money and thought that was love. I gave you things and thought that was enough. I built an empire and forgot to build a family. Richard paused, looking directly at the camera. Michael, I pushed you too hard. I made you think love was conditional, that you had to earn it through success and performance. I'm sorry. You were enough just as you were. Michael's expression didn't change, but his hands clenched into fists on the table. Grace, I put you on a pedestal and forgot you were human. I made you think mistakes weren't allowed, that you always had to be perfect. I'm sorry. You didn't need to be perfect to be loved." Grace looked away from the screen, her jaw tight. "Daniel, I rejected who you were because I didn't understand it. I tried to make you into a version of me instead of celebrating the person you already were. I'm sorry. Your path was valid even though it wasn't mine." Daniel started crying silently. "And Zainab, my baby girl, I enabled your destruction because I felt guilty about your mother's death. I gave you money when I should have given you boundaries. I saved you from consequences when I should have let you learn from them. I'm sorry. I didn't protect you. I just postponed your growth." Zainab was shaking, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know if you loved me or my money," Richard continued on the video. "Maybe both. Maybe neither. But I want you to know, I loved you. Imperfectly. Inadequately. But truly." The video showed Richard taking a deep breath. "The will I've left you is not meant to punish you or control you. It's meant to give each of you what I think you actually need, not what you want. Michael, you need to learn that you can't control everything. Grace, you need to learn that wealth without purpose is empty. Daniel, you need to learn to value your own ideas instead of letting others exploit you. And Zainab, you need to learn that you're capable of more than you believe." Richard looked directly into the camera one last time. "I hope you can forgive me for being a flawed father. And I hope you can learn from my mistakes. Don't wait until someone is gone to tell them you love them. Don't sacrifice relationships for wealth. Don't let money become more important than family." The video ended. The conference room was silent except for the sound of Daniel and Zainab crying. Then Michael stood up abruptly. "This is emotional manipulation. All of it. The conditional inheritance, the video, the threat about contesting the will. He's playing mind games with us, even after death." "Michael," Grace started. "No," Michael cut her off. "I'm not going to sit here and pretend this is some beautiful final message. Our father spent his entire life putting money above family, and now he wants to lecture us about relationships? He wants to tell us we're flawed when he was the one who taught us that money equals love." "He admitted he was wrong," Daniel said quietly. "Admitting you're wrong doesn't erase 30 years of damage," Michael shot back. "And it doesn't change the fact that he's using his will to manipulate us into behaving the way he wants even after he's dead." Grace spoke up. "Michael, for once in your life, shut up and think. Dad just gave you $50 million and 40% of a multi-billion-dollar company. You're angry because it's not more? Because he had the audacity to ask you not to tear the family apart fighting over it. I'm angry because this whole thing is a trap. Don't you see it? He's forcing us to accept his version of fairness or lose everything. That's not love. That's control." Barrister Hardy IME closed his folder. "I think this meeting is concluded. You each have copies of the will and all relevant appendices. The estate will begin the transfer process immediately. If any of you have questions about the legal mechanics, you can contact my office. But I strongly encourage all of you to think carefully before taking any action that could invoke the forfeiture clause." Michael grabbed his copy of the will and stormed out of the office, Kenneth Hudor following quickly behind him. Grace gathered her documents and left without speaking to anyone. Daniel and Zainab remained seated, both still crying. Barrister Hardy IME put a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Your father loved you very much. I hope you know that." Daniel nodded, unable to speak. After everyone had left, Richard turned off the monitor in his apartment. He sat in the darkness for a long time, processing what he had just witnessed. Michael was angry and felt controlled. Grace was calculating her next move. Daniel was heartbroken but accepting. Zainab was devastated but also, perhaps, hopeful. Richard had seen their immediate reactions to his death and to his will. But the real test was still to come. The test of what they would do in the weeks and months that followed. Would they honor his wishes? Would they fight each other despite the consequences? Would any of them change? Richard needed to know. So he continued watching. The days after. In the week following the will reading, Richard monitored all 4 of his children through Yusuf's camera network. Michael's behavior was the most disturbing. Despite the clear penalty for contesting the will, Michael was actively exploring ways around it. On April 10th, 4 days after the will reading, Michael met with Kenneth Hudor at a private restaurant in Victoria Island. The conversation was captured by a recording device that Emeka's team had placed at the table the night before, disguised as a salt shaker. The forfeiture clause is the problem, Kenneth explained. If you contest the will directly and lose, you lose everything. But there might be indirect strategies. Such as? Michael asked. We could argue that your father was mentally incompetent when he signed the will. If we can prove diminished capacity, the will becomes invalid, and the estate distributes according to intestacy laws, which would give you a larger share. Do we have evidence of diminished capacity? Not yet, but we could generate it. We could get doctors to testify that the cancer treatments affected his judgment. We could find witnesses who will say he was confused or irrational in his final weeks. Michael thought about this, but the will was signed in February, and he didn't die until March.
He was still working during that time.
How do we prove he was incompetent if he was signing business contracts and managing operations? It's difficult, but not impossible. We'd need to find inconsistencies, contradictions, anything that suggests cognitive decline. What about the addendum? The one signed 3 days before his death about the forfeiture clause? Can we prove that one was coerced or forged? Kenneth nodded slowly. That's actually a better angle. If we can prove the addendum is invalid, then the original will stand, but without the penalty clause. Then you could contest the distribution without losing your inheritance. How do we prove it's invalid? We need a handwriting expert to analyze the signature. We'd need to question the witnesses who signed it. We'd need to establish that someone, maybe the lawyer himself, had something to gain from adding that clause. Michael leaned back in his chair. Barrister Hardy has been Dad's lawyer for 25 years. He's been loyal the entire time. It's hard to argue he's suddenly corrupt. Unless, Kenneth said carefully, your father promised him something in exchange for his loyalty. A percentage of the estate, perhaps, or payment for special services rendered. If we can establish that Barrister Hardy had a financial motive to shape the will in a particular way, we can challenge his integrity as executor. Michael smiled. That's good. That's very good. Start investigating Barrister Hardy. I want to know everything about his finances, his clients, his associates. If there's dirt, find it. Richard watched this footage and felt sick. Michael wasn't grieving. He wasn't reflecting on Richard's video message. He was scheming to undermine everything Richard had tried to do. But Michael's scheming had a flaw. He was being watched, and every step he took was being documented. Grace's move. Grace's approach was more subtle than Michael's, but equally calculating. On April 12th, Grace had a meeting at the Lekki Peninsula Hospital, the hospital Richard had left to her in his will. The meeting was with the hospital's board of directors, and Yusuf had installed a camera in the boardroom months earlier as part of a security upgrade. Grace sat at the head of the table, her posture confident and professional. "Thank you all for coming," Grace began. "As you know, I am now the sole owner of this facility, as per my father's will. I wanted to meet with you today to discuss the future direction of this institution." Dr. Adelik, the board chairman, spoke up. "Grace, first let me express our condolences. Your father was a visionary in healthcare. His legacy here will continue." "Actually," Grace said, her voice cool, "that's what I want to talk about. My father built this hospital with a specific philosophy, providing high-quality care regardless of a patient's ability to pay. That philosophy created the charity wing, the subsidized care programs, and the community outreach initiatives." The board members nodded. "That philosophy," Grace continued, "is no longer sustainable. The charity wing loses approximately 120 million naira per year. The subsidized programs lose another 80 million. We're hemorrhaging money on people who can't pay while turning away patients who can afford premium services because we don't have the bed space or resources." Dr. Adelik frowned. "Grace, those programs are what give this hospital its reputation. They're what earned us government contracts and international recognition." "Reputation doesn't pay salaries," Grace replied. "Reputation doesn't upgrade equipment. Reputation doesn't expand facilities. Money does. And we're wasting money on charity when we could be investing in growth." Another board member, Dr. Orkarafor, spoke up. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing we phase out the charity wing over the next 6 months. Patients currently receiving subsidized care will be referred to government hospitals. Going forward, this facility will operate as a premium private hospital serving patients who can afford our services." The room erupted in protests. "This goes against everything your father believed in," Dr. Adelik said. "My father is dead," Grace said flatly, "and I'm not running this hospital based on his beliefs. I'm running it based on sound business principles." "You'll destroy the hospital's mission. I'll save the hospital's financial future. Look at these numbers." Grace pulled out a presentation and began projecting financial data on the screen. "If we eliminate the charity programs and focus exclusively on premium services, we can increase our profit margin by 40% within the first year. That's an additional 200 million naira that we can invest in better doctors, better equipment, better facilities. We'll also lose our government contracts," Dr. Orkarafor pointed out. "Government contracts are low margin and high hassle," Grace replied. "I'd rather have fewer patients paying premium prices than thousands of patients paying subsidized rates. The math is simple." The argument continued for over an hour, with the board members trying to convince Grace to honor her father's vision and Grace remaining coldly focused on profit. Finally, Grace stood up. "Let me be clear. I own this hospital now. You all serve at my pleasure. If you don't like the direction I'm taking, you're welcome to resign. But the changes are happening regardless of your opinions." She left the meeting, leaving a room full of shocked and angry board members behind her. Richard watched this footage and realized that his daughter hadn't just disregarded his wishes, she had actively dismantled them within days of his death. Everything he had built to help people, Grace was destroying to maximize profit. Daniel's vulnerability. Daniel's situation was different. He wasn't scheming or destroying. He was simply being manipulated. On April 14th, Daniel met with Chidinma at a cafe in Yaba. Emeka had arranged for one of his associates to sit at a nearby table with a directional microphone, capturing their conversation. "How are you holding up?" Chidinma asked, reaching across the table to hold Daniel's hand. Daniel looked exhausted. His eyes were red from crying. "I don't know. I miss him. I keep thinking about all the conversations we never had, all the things I never told him. I know, baby. It's hard. Chidinma squeezed his hand sympathetically. The will reading was complicated, Daniel continued. I got the family home in Onitsha and $20 million for an education trust, but Michael and Grace are angry. They think Dad was being unfair. What do you think? I think Dad knew me better than I thought he did. The home in Onitsha is where he grew up. It's full of memories. And the education trust is exactly the kind of work I want to do. It's like he was giving me permission to follow my own path instead of trying to compete with Michael and Grace. That's beautiful, Chidinma said. And $20 million is a lot of money for an education trust. You could do amazing things with that. I know.
I've been thinking about it.
I want to build schools in rural areas. Hire good teachers. Provide scholarships for kids who can't afford university. That's wonderful. You'll need help managing that much money, though. Investment strategies, fund management, legal structures. Daniel nodded. I guess I'll need to hire people. Or, Chidinma said carefully, you could work with people you trust. People who care about you and want to see you succeed. Daniel looked at her. What do you mean? I mean, I have connections in the investment world. I know people who could help you grow that 20 million into 50 million or more. Then you could build even more schools, help even more kids. Richard felt his stomach drop. Here it was. The setup. Daniel looked uncertain. I don't know, Chidinma. Last time you connected me with an investment opportunity, I lost 20 million naira. That was different, Chidinma said quickly. That was my fault. I trusted the wrong people, and they took advantage of both of us. But I learned from that mistake. The people I'm connected with now are legitimate, registered investment firms with track records. I don't want to lose this money. It's not just for me. It's for the kids who need those schools.
Exactly.
Which is why you need to grow it responsibly. Keeping 20 million in a bank account earning 2% interest is a waste. You could be earning 15, 20, even 30% returns with the right investments. Daniel wavered. I should probably talk to a financial advisor first. Someone independent. Of course, Chidinma agreed. But at least let me introduce you to these investment managers. Hear what they have to say. If you don't like it, walk away. But don't close yourself off to opportunities just because one deal went bad. Daniel thought about this for a long moment. Then he nodded.
Okay.
I'll meet them. But I'm not making any decisions without doing research first. That's all I'm asking, Chidinma said, smiling. Richard watched this conversation and wanted to scream at his son. Daniel was walking into the same trap again. Chidinma was using his grief and his idealism to set him up for another scam. But Daniel couldn't see it. Because Daniel wanted to believe that people were good, that his girlfriend loved him, that everyone had noble intentions. Richard made a decision in that moment. He couldn't just watch Daniel destroy himself. He needed to intervene. But how could he intervene without revealing that he was alive? Zainab's transformation. Of all 4 children, Zainab's response to Richard's death was the most surprising. 3 days after the will reading, Zainab checked herself into the Lekki Rehabilitation Center, a private facility that specialized in addiction treatment. The cost was 3 million naira per month, which Zainab paid using the first installment from her inheritance. Emika's team couldn't get cameras inside the rehabilitation center. The security and privacy protocols were too strict, but they could monitor Zainab's phone activity and track her movements when she left the facility for approved outings. On April 20th, Zainab called Daniel from the rehab center. Emika's team had installed tracking software on Daniel's phone weeks earlier, which allowed them to record the call. "Daniel, it's me," Zainab said when he answered. "Zainab,
How are you?
I've been worried." "I'm okay. I'm in rehab. I checked myself in last week." Daniel's voice filled with emotion. That's amazing, Z. I'm so proud of you." "I'm doing it for Dad," Zainab said quietly. "The will said I need to maintain sobriety for 5 years to get the full inheritance. But that's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because he believed I could. And I want to prove he was right. He was right. He was absolutely right. I'm scared, Danny. I've tried getting clean before, and I always failed. What if I fail again? Then you try again." That's what Dad would have said. Zainab was quiet for a moment. "I miss him so much. I keep thinking about all the times I disappointed him, all the times I hurt him, and now I can't ever make it right." "You're making it right now," Daniel said. "By getting clean, by going to university like he wanted, by becoming the person he knew you could be." "I wish he was here to see it." "Maybe he is," Daniel said softly. "Maybe he's watching somehow." If only Daniel knew how right he was. Over the next 2 weeks, Zainab stayed in the rehabilitation program. She attended group therapy sessions, individual counseling, and addiction education classes. She followed the strict schedule. She didn't try to leave or break the rules. On May 1st, Zainab had a phone session with a university admissions counselor from the University of Lagos. Emika's team recorded this call as well. "I want to enroll for the next semester," Zainab told the counselor. "I dropped out of Stanford years ago, but I'm ready to come back to school now." "What program are you interested in?" "Psychology. I want to study addiction and mental health. I want to help people who are going through what I'm going through." The counselor walked her through the application process, the required documents, the deadlines. Zainab took detailed notes and asked intelligent questions. After the call ended, Zainab sat alone in her room at the rehab center. She pulled out a photograph of Richard, one of the few photos where both of them were smiling, taken years ago before everything fell apart. "I'm going to do this, Daddy," Zainab whispered to the photo. "I promise I'm going to do this." Richard watched the video footage of this moment and felt tears streaming down his face. One of his children was actually trying. One of them had heard his message and was taking it to heart. One of them was becoming better instead of worse. But even as Richard felt this small spark of hope about Zainab, he knew he couldn't let the others continue down their destructive paths. It was time to make a decision. It was time to come back from the dead. The return. Richard spent 3 days planning his return with Emika. They debated different approaches: dramatic public revelation, quiet private meetings, legal intervention. Each option had risks. "If you reveal yourself publicly, your children will be humiliated," Emika warned. "The media will destroy them. They'll be seen as greedy vultures who couldn't wait for their father to die. That kind of public shame could permanently damage them." "Maybe they need to be humiliated," Richard said bitterly. "Maybe. But is that what you want? Public revenge? Or do you want actual reconciliation?" Richard thought about this. "I want them to understand what they've become. I want them to see themselves clearly." "Then do it privately," Emika suggested. "Walk back into your house. Face them directly. Let them react without an audience. Give them a chance to respond honestly without performing for cameras or crowds." Richard agreed. They chose May 7th, 2023, exactly 53 days after Richard's staged death, as the day of revelation. On that morning, Richard got dressed in his apartment in Victoria Island for the first time in nearly 2 months. He put on one of his old suits. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. He had lost weight. His face looked older, harder. The experience of watching his children had changed something fundamental in him. Emeka drove Richard to the family house in Ikoyi. They arrived at 10 o'clock a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Richard knew from camera surveillance that Michael was at the house that day, having a meeting with Kenneth Hudor in Richard's old study. Grace was also there, reviewing hospital documents in the living room. Daniel was teaching at the university, and Zainab was still at the rehabilitation center. Richard stood outside the front door of his own house, his hand shaking as he reached for the handle. "Are you ready?" Emeka asked. "No," Richard said honestly, "but it's time anyway." He opened the door and walked inside. The house was exactly as he remembered it. Same furniture, same art on the walls, same smell of expensive wood polish and air conditioning. But it felt different now. It felt like a museum of a life that no longer existed. Richard walked through the foyer and into the living room. Grace was sitting on the couch, surrounded by papers and her laptop. She looked up when she heard footsteps. For a moment, her brain couldn't process what she was seeing. Her father was dead. She had seen his body. She had attended his funeral. She had buried him. But he was standing in the living room, alive and solid and real. Grace's laptop slid off her lap and crashed to the floor. She stood up so fast she knocked over her coffee cup, spilling it across the papers.
Dad.
Her voice was barely a whisper. "Hello, Grace." Grace's face cycled through shock, confusion, disbelief, and then, as the full reality hit her, rage. "You're alive? You're alive." Her scream brought Michael running from the study. He appeared in the doorway, saw Richard, and stopped dead. "What the—" Michael couldn't finish the sentence. He looked like he was about to have a heart attack. "Hello, Michael," Richard said calmly. "This isn't possible," Michael said.
You're dead.
"We buried you." "I saw the body." "You saw a body," Richard corrected. "Not my body." The realization hit them both at the same time. "You faked your death," Grace said, her voice shaking with fury. "You staged a whole thing. The accident. The funeral. Everything." "Yes." Michael's face turned red.
Why?
"Why would you do something so twisted?" Richard looked at his two oldest children, the ones he had trusted most, invested in most, loved most, and said the words he had been rehearsing for weeks. "Because I needed to know if you loved me, or if you just loved my money. And now I know the answer." The room exploded in shouting, tears, accusations, and revelations that would change the family forever. But that's a story for part 2. If you want to know what happened when Richard confronted his children with everything he saw, subscribe to this channel right now. Did Michael and Grace change after being exposed? Did Daniel escape Chidinma's manipulation? Did Zainab stay sober? And most importantly, could this family ever heal from Richard's ultimate test? Part 2 drops next week, and I promise you won't believe how this story ends. Comment below. Was Richard justified in faking his death? Or did he go too far?